All right, what's up? Good morning for another Saturday money morning talking about consumer proposals. What's up, Andrew?
Hey, good morning. Good morning.
All right, consumer proposals, man. What's the dealio? Pros and cons.
Pros and cons. Well, there's obviously going to be a lot of pros. There's going to be a lot of cons. Reason why I wanted to talk about the subject is because it's clearly an option for Canadians to eliminate their debts, which is the field we're in. So I wanted to cover the topic. And this stemmed from a case example from a few weeks ago in the office. I had a client that had to move residence, and in the move, his rent had gone up, and he had stated that with his budget changing, he was not able to afford the payments any further to eliminate his debt. And within a matter of a week or two, we got notice from a trustee that he had signed a consumer proposal, which is a form of bankruptcy under the Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act, which
Did he
is
know
a
that? Did he actually get that part of the equation explained to him, or did they kind of breeze over it?
you never know what they're told by the trustee and what, if they are told, what they retain. It's a lot of new information for people, and telling them something that they're filing a consumer proposal. It's a form of bankruptcy. It's under section, I think it's 52 or 53 of the Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act. People don't digest that. They don't retain that information. All they really want to care about is, are you going to get my debt eliminated for me? Are you going to get rid of my debt for me? And how much do I have to pay? And that leads me to the point which I wanted to raise is, when I looked over the paperwork, his monthly payment was quite a bit higher than what he was paying into our program.
How much higher?
I think it was like $65 a month extra, and he was suggesting that he couldn't afford to continue our program because of the increase in rent. So I thought to myself, how could you afford the consumer proposal payment if it's higher than our payment? So it didn't make a lot of sense. And then it was for an extra 1 year of term on the CP. CP is consumer proposal. So, we reached out to the client and we said, listen, we got your paperwork and you're obviously entitled to move forward with this consumer proposal if you wish, but did you look at the documentation? You're signing for a larger monthly payment and for an extra 1 year of term, which means you're going to be paying back an extra like $10,000 or whatever it was. It didn't make a lot of sense. And he then admitted that he didn't read the paperwork. That was essentially what it was. He goes, I didn't know. I didn't read it. And it was just so surprising that he didn't know what he was getting into, and that he was prepared to commit to a program that would eliminate the debt just like ours, but for a higher monthly cost, which he claimed he couldn't afford because his rent had gone up, and for an extra year. So it looks like we just lost Richard from the broadcast. I'm just going to see what he's saying here because he sent me a quick message. Okay, so he just lost his power, so I'm just going to continue the stream in his absence. So essentially, that was the case study or the story that we received recently in the office about an individual who didn't really necessarily pay attention to what he was committing to, and it was surprising, but at the same time, it wasn't surprising because from the industry, I noticed that a lot of people don't read what they're engaging into and what they're going to be proceeding with. It's just the norm in today's days and times. But also with this broadcast, I wanted to touch and talk briefly about the pros and cons of the consumer proposal program. So, as I've said earlier, it's essentially a program that is administered under the Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act in Canada. It's federally regulated across every province and territory, so it doesn't change from location to location. Regardless of where you live, you can be in British Columbia, it will be the exact same legislation you need to adhere to and follow if you lived in Quebec or Ontario. It's all the same. And the program is essentially a structured debt elimination plan that will eliminate all the debts, including government debt. So that's one of the pros that a consumer proposal does have. It will eliminate any debt you owe to Canada Revenue Agency if you owe on income tax arrears. And the program is structured over a 60-month program. So the maximum term, and essentially almost every term, will be a 60-month term. The reason why it will almost always be a 60-month term is because the purpose of a trustee is to try to recover as much money for the creditors as possible, and therefore the maximum term would get the maximum amount back for the creditors. So I've rarely seen a consumer proposal where it was less than 60 months. I do recall seeing one at 36 months. It was a much smaller consumer proposal payment and overall repayment schedule. I think it was for a small amount of debt, and I say small, roughly 10 to 15,000. Most debts that we see are exceeding 30,000. So that was a smaller debt in terms of the examples. And you make a monthly payment to the trustee. The trustee takes the money in and essentially disperses it to the creditors. Typically once a year is what they do. By law, they have to remit the payments once per annum. So they have to send at least one payment per year over this 5-year program. So they will typically send 5 payments in total annually, 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 year, 5 year, and then your consumer proposal is done. So one of the advantages, as I suggested, is the fact that you can include any CRA, Canada Revenue Agency debt into that consumer proposal. And one of the other benefits that it will do is that it will eliminate your debt in that 5-year term. So you will know that once your 5-year term is up, you are out of debt. That's another positive about the consumer proposal. One of the negatives about the consumer proposal is that one of the biggest negatives is that a trustee is a court-appointed agent for the creditors. So while you go to the trustee with the impression that the trustee is going to be representing you to eliminate your debt, they are a court-appointed agent for your creditors, so their best interests are for the creditor. Now, on top of that, a consumer proposal is essentially paid in a structure whereby the trustee will get more money in fees the more they collect from you. So it's their initiative and their incentive to get you, the consumer, to pay a larger payment to the consumer proposal so they make a larger fee. So there is a conflict of interest there. Certainly a conflict of interest there. How can they be doing their fiduciary duty to a creditor if they're trying to get you the best deal, and flip vice versa? How can they get you the best deal in a consumer proposal if their duty is to facilitate higher repayment to the creditor? It is clearly a conflict, and therefore it's one significant con for a consumer proposal. Our program is essentially the only program in Canada where if you retain us, we have a fiduciary duty exclusively to yourself, the consumer, our client, and there's no conflict there for the best interest of creditors. One of the other things a consumer proposal can do for you, which is a positive, is if you have assets, such as a residence, a house, which is most people's biggest asset, you can retain that asset in the consumer proposal filing as long as you do not have significant equity in the property. So if you're sitting on a property, and in today's market with properties increasing drastically in value, I think right now there was a recent publication. The average house price in Canada is about $800,000 or $900,000. If memory serves me correct, that's pretty substantial. So if the house price is $900,000 and it's gone up from, say, $500,000 from just 2-3 years ago, most people are sitting on some substantial equity in your property. So if that individual looks to go to a trustee to initiate a bankruptcy or a consumer proposal, the chances are that consumer proposal will be full payment back to the creditor because you have sufficient equity in your property to liquidate, which means to pull from, to pay off your debts in full. So they're not going to let you go through a proposal at a reduced payout if you've got money in your property to pay the debts in full. So that is a pro and a con. You get to retain your asset, but if your asset has value, you're paying back the full value of your debt. And therefore, another con is if you're going to be taking that approach, paying back the full amount of your debt. Let's just say, hypothetically speaking, it's $10,000 of debt, and the consumer proposal totals payments for $10,000, which means you're paying it all off in full. You are essentially now going through a structured debt elimination program, which will hinder your credit score. Looks like we got Rich back.
The Russians got me. The Russian hackers got me.
Hello. What happened to you?
I don't know. The power went out.
All right. So anyway, as I was saying, welcome back, Richard. Welcome back.
I'm actually glad that this software keeps running if there's a power outage because it's browser based. So if I have a shutdown on my end, you can still carry on.
Yeah. Well, that's, you're the host of the show, right? So when you lost your connection, I thought mine would go too, as you're the host of the broadcast. But anyway, we're back up and running. You're back and joining, and I've
sorry, I missed a few minutes of that, but yeah. So you're on the pros, you're on the cons now. Like, where are you at?
I was basically mixing them all in. I'm just talking about the pros and the cons. I gave him the case study of the example from the client at the office. I was just about to wrap up actually, because I was getting to the end of the pros and the cons. I was just talking about how the cons was the last con I was going to talk about, and was just touching on briefly before you re-entered the broadcast, is if you're in a consumer proposal
Mm-hmm.
and you're repaying the debt in full through the proposal, which is possible,
Mm-hmm.
you are also then having a negative impact to your credit rating because the trustee is reporting to the bureau that you're in a restructured repayment schedule over a 60-month program as a consumer proposal, and that alone will have damage to your credit rating.
Correct.
But one of the other facts is once you've completed and graduated that consumer proposal program, that 5-year term, that notation remains on your credit file for a further 3 years thereafter.
Mm-hmm.
So the total duration that you're going to be having noted in a consumer proposal, a form of bankruptcy, is 8 years. So if you're paying it back in full and it's going to damage your credit for 8 years, there really is no benefit to go through that proposal. You might as well just pay it in full yourself over monthly payments and not have that negative notation to your credit file that will stay there for an 8-year period. So these are things that you need to consider. And as I mentioned, with property values going up drastically over the years, most people that are homeowners have got significant equity in their property,
Mm-hmm.
which means you would be forced to make a full repayment in the consumer proposal. And it does not make sense if you're making a full repayment and then having that negative credit hit for 8 years on your credit file. Over to you, Rich.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what you covered in detail because I missed a few minutes, but consumer proposals work. We've seen them work for a while. The downsides that I've seen is a lot of the time people are introduced to them by deceptive marketing practices, not necessarily by the trustee, but more from these like arms of the trustee where they walk them across the hall, like they'll advertise, you can get out of debt. Somebody comes into some of these like boutique, like 1-man, 200 square foot offices, fill out some paperwork. They take the first 3 months worth of payment or something like that. And they walk them across the hall to a trustee and go, here you go. He'll take care of you now. If you're going to deal with a consumer proposal, deal directly with the trustee, not one of those outfits. They're primarily just shilling nonsense. They're grifters. So stay away from that. Make sure you walk into it with your eyes wide open so you know what the cost of the program is. You're not going to get all the details from them. They just kind of breeze over much of the stuff, like how it affects your credit, the fact that they are essentially like one of the big problems that I have with the way that the Bankruptcy Insolvencies Act for people getting out of credit card debt is that even though you pay them for the service, and this really grinds my gears, I would hate paying somebody for a service that's really just kind of like screwing me over, because the payment goes to a organization, but their fiduciary duty, according to legislation, is to look after the best interest of the creditor. So you're paying somebody to take care of the banks and credit card companies is what it boils down to. It's written into the legislation. It's not disputed. They'll even admit it if you ask them, or if you push. Sometimes they'll dance around it. But that's the problem that I have with it. And of course, the more money that they get back, they get paid a higher amount. So they're not motivated to save you money like the staff in the office with Andrew, who get an incentive to reduce your debt as much as possible. They're on the other end of the spectrum. They're incentivized to get as much money back to the creditor as possible because they're paid a percentage of what goes back to the creditor, not a percentage of what they save you. If they were truly in the best interest of the consumer, the government would rewrite the legislation to say that they get paid based on what they save the consumer, but they're not. They're getting paid based on what they send back to the creditor. They also get paid more money on a consumer proposal, generally speaking, than a bankruptcy, which they don't often talk about. Let's just skip over that sort of thing. But it's an effective option, especially if you are completely insolvent and if you have tons of debt and no equity to speak of whatsoever. Then it might be something that you might want to consider. But for the most part, I would recommend talking to one of the senior debt consultants in the office with Andrew, which brings me to the banner as we kind of get off the show. So if you owe $15,000 or more in Canadian credit card debt, you can learn how to legally reduce it by 50 to 75% and get debt free over a few years. The average now is still 4 years.
Yeah, it varies, but 4 years is probably the most common term that we're offering.
TotalDebtFreedom.ca. Just fill out the form. When you complete the form, the next page after that, once you submit your information, will let you schedule in a call with a consultant. Make sure you book the call. People that are serious about getting out of debt immediately will book the call. The availability, is always limited because they're busy, dealing with stuff. So schedule yourself in a call, make sure you're ready for it, ask all the questions you want. And if it's a good fit, they'll send you over a quote. If it's not a good fit, they'll likely send you over to a better option. Anything else to add before we wrap up?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I did mention some of the stuff that you just pointed to about the fiduciary duty and the fees that they charge trustees and how they're incentivized to get as much money back to the creditors as possible. One thing I forgot to mention in the broadcast is one of the major pros that a consumer proposal can offer an individual is if an individual is being garnished by a creditor or even by Canada Revenue Agency for income tax arrears or a debt that you've owed to a creditor who've successfully sued you in the court of law and obtained judgment from a judge, you can have that garnishment stopped under a consumer proposal. So if you have gone through litigation, the creditor was successful and they've commenced garnishment of your salary, and depending on which province you're in will depend on how much percentage they can take from your salary. Here in Ontario, it's 20%. Mm-hmm. So if you're struggling now because you're losing 20% of your income on a garnishment, one of the major pros is that the trustee and the consumer proposal will lift the garnishment, which is a significant benefit to an individual struggling. And that is one of the biggest things that individuals are going to trustees for, is not only to eliminate the debt, but to stop and lift a garnishment off off their salary. So that's a significant pro that a consumer proposal can have.
How often is it that somebody has to answer like an actual lawsuit, like not the threat of a lawsuit, but they actually have to answer a lawsuit and deal with a garnishment? How often does that happen?
The threat of a garnishment or the reality of a garnishment is extremely rare, like extremely rare. And I'm not privy to the reasons behind that. Like no one on the other side of the spectrum, so what we call opposing counsel, they never tell you why a creditor does not proceed with garnishment in most cases. But
I know from my experience in the collection industry, because I spent like a good time in there, it was threatened to just about everybody. But I don't even think we had hundreds of thousands, potentially even millions of files in collections. And I worked in the largest one in Canada at the time. And I think there was probably less than 100 legal files. So, I mean, like you do the math on that, like 100 actual legal files versus over 1 million, in collections. They don't often sue people, but I mean, they will threaten it.
And then the ones that they do sue and the ones they get judgment on, I would say it's probably less than 5% of those that they move forward with the garnishment of wages.
It's hard to enforce because they have to know where you work, and if you move jobs, and they have to find out where you work from there. It's generally not a good practice to throw good money after bad. I've seen them do it. Like I think their goal, for the most part, seems to be grab a lien, place it on a house, because it's not like a job where you can pick up and move to another job. It's difficult to sell a house. I mean, you can't sell a house without transferring the title if there's any liens on it, right? So
correct, yeah.
That's something that they'll look for. But
that's exactly what that's what they look for.
Yeah. Anyway, we'll leave it on that note. We're going to be back doing these on a more regular basis. If there's any topics you want to see us talk about, leave a comment below. We'll keep an eye out for them and maybe make it the subject of a future episode. Again, the stuff we're talking about here is limited to Canadian debt. So if you're watching us from somewhere else in the world, with a different kind of debt, the specifics about how the mechanics work are dealing with Canada. So that's the micro level. Like on a macro level, you could say that this stuff that we're talking to basically applies to personal finance around the world. So just to be clear about that. All right, you ready to wrap up?
Yeah, I think next week we're going to talk about bankruptcy. Are we not?
Sure, let's do bankruptcy.
Yeah, so next week's topic will be pros and cons of bankruptcy.
There's other stuff that we can talk about too. Like we could hit on topics like inflation, which is a big thing that's happening right now. But just leave a comment below and let us know if there's something that's more pressing on your mind in the comments, and we'll keep an eye out for it. We'll see you guys in the next one.